جان اجازه است آخرشم تو مصروف چیستی؟
یک داستان.
One of the producers, Rebecca Yeldam, sent me the book when I was in New York in 2003, right when it came out on hardcover, and I read it, and I remember it very well because I was doing the blackout in New York, and I basically read it during the day, and it was it grabbed me. I said, oh my God, this is a beautiful book, a beautiful story.
Well, I was born in Kabul in 1965. My parents were educated professionals. My father was a diplomat, my mother was a high school teacher. So I kind of grew up in an environment like Amir and the Kite Runner. We moved to France in 1976. Of course, while we were there, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, so we never went back to Afghanistan. My family moved to the US in 1980, and I've lived in the States pretty much since 1980. I kind of became a writer by accident, really. I mean, I was practicing physician for 8.5 years. Eventually, the Kite Runner became the success, and I decided to take writing full time. But I grew up in Kabul writing stories. I wrote short stories. In fact, the little short story that Amir writes for Hassan and the movie was a short story that I had written when I was a kid. It was really my first love.
I heard you write.
Would you like to read one of my stories?
The Kite Runner was a short story initially. I had seen a news report about the Taliban having banned kite flying, and so the kites was the first thing that came to my mind. That was the central image of that short story, and of course the novel. And then I kind of wove a story around the sport of kite flying, which I had played when I was growing up. And I thought about these two boys as friends, and I thought to myself, well, wouldn't it be interesting if their friendship is really uneven, if maybe there's even an element of unreciprocated love and to some extent. And so eventually the characters began growing, and it became this friendship between these two boys from polar ends of society, separated by history and religion and customs and so on. Eventually, that short story was the basis of the novel, which I began in March of 2001, and I ended up writing that novel in about 15 months. I think I sent that novel around in June of 2002, and 9/11 still was relatively fresh in people's minds. Afghanistan was still the only war we were fighting at that time, and it was still making news. And so I think there was an interest in my novel because it was sort of something unusual and fresh.
We know about Afghanistan today, and what we read in the press is mostly negative, and it's a very tainted image of Afghanistan. And I think, the book Kite Runner really shows you that this world existed which wasn't like that these people went through 30 years of war and been through so much.
I went back in March of 2003, about 3 months before the Kite Runner was published. So I wrote it first, then went to Afghanistan after 27-year absence. And I had a very similar experience to Amir in the novel and in the film, as I went back to a place that was ostensibly my home, and part of it felt like a homecoming. On the other hand, I felt like an outsider. I mean, when in the film, when Amir is coming back to Kabul, he has to kind of relearn the ropes, as it were, and his guide tells him, here's what's happened, and brings him up to date. And I felt a lot of that. I felt like I'm an outsider. In the novel, there's a line where Amir says, I feel like a tourist in my own country. And to some extent, that's exactly how I felt.
You've always been a tourist here. You just didn't know it.
The story starts in the 70s in Afghanistan, and it's beautiful. And then basically through the invasion of the Russians, we get catapulted into San Francisco, into America in the 80s. And then basically we get thrown back through a phone call from Ramin Khan back into Afghanistan during the control of the Taliban in 2000. And that's sort of the one goes through all these 3 decades, 70s, 80s, and then back to 2000, 30 years of life of these people. And one of the things with the Kite Runner are the metaphors. Obviously, the metaphors are throughout, and I tried them through images to use them in the movie because I love metaphors. And it's obviously, the metaphor of the core incident what Kite Runner is built around, which is basically the rape, and obviously the parallel to it that the country was raped.
تو از افغانستان چی میفهمی؟ وقتی که کمونستان ملاهای ما را کشتن دمازتای ماشاش کردن گم بودی.
I went to Afghanistan in 2003, and I would talk to people, and they would have this exact complaint that, while we were fighting the Soviets, everybody was supporting us. When the Soviets left, everybody lost interest, and then people raped our country. And they actually used that word. People raped our country, and everybody just watched. And I had written this novel 3 months before with a scene that was just eerily similar to what they were saying, and I would get goosebumps because that alley scene to me kind of plays in a larger way. And that if you take Hassan as a stand-in for Afghanistan and Amir as the international community, the international community just kind of stood and watched as Afghanistan was brutalized over and over by these various regimes. So to me, that scene is also representative of something bigger than what's going on actually in the story. And I wanted that scene in the alley to be truly troubling, and something that Amir 30 years later would still be haunted by that. And so that was the ugliest act I could think of.
یک اپ از من بشنوی از اینجا خدا بکن تو دی کار لایق هستی.
For me, it was always a story about redemption and forgiveness, and I always saw it as an intimate epic. You have this, obviously, this epic structure, but ultimately it's a very character-driven film.
مگوی بری دروغ گفتیم؟ نمیفهمی؟ از دروغ کده خواه میخواه.
Very, very briefly, I entertained the idea of writing this novel from the viewpoint of Hassan, the other boy. And I immediately saw that Hassan is an entirely different character. He's rooted in who he is. That's who he is. Whereas Amir was a shifty character. I mean, he was somebody that was capable of tenderness, but also capable of some really atrocious things, and who was capable of betraying, of lying, of conniving, but never without being aware of what he's doing. He's not aloof to his own failings and his own shortcomings. He wears it on his sleeve.
هر چیزی که شده باید بین خود حل کنیم. بیش از اینکه بسیار دیر شود و بیش از اینکه گپ کلان شود.
Working with an anti-hero is always fascinating because, anti-heroes are much more complex because there's a much more psychological depth going on in anti-heroes because there's a guilt factor, there's a fear factor, that these different factors, but to heal the wound and to get over the guilt and to go on that journey is more interesting for an audience than if you have a hero in itself.
He has remorse, and I feel readers of the novel and I think audiences of the film will see themselves in this character as somebody who is deeply flawed like the rest of us.
And we all are not perfect, and we all have done things in our lives we ultimately want to redeem ourselves for, or we weren't courageous enough, or fear was leading us in another way. And I think so much in our life is led by fear. And I think, it's something beautiful that ultimately, if we can recognize that fear and forgive ourselves for being fearful in certain moments for not standing up.
میگه چی کار کنم چی یک مرمی دستینش بزنه مردیش بر من خوشایند است.
بگوی پیش از اینکه اینطور یک بیشرمی را ببینم.
بابا بشین سرتم فر میکنم.
برات چیز یاد ندادم.
I think if we as human beings would stand up in the name of love and stand up for one another, I think the planet would be in a much different place.
It's a very bad time, but you should come. There's a way to be good again, Amir.
If I take two, Seema.
Hey, shoot! Don't do it! And action!
I didn't think it would be a good movie. I mean, I initially thought a lot of the drama was inside Amir's head. A lot of the conflict was internal. But everybody who read the book said this would make a great movie. And I eventually came around to thinking that too. I met with Bill Horberg And Rebecca Yeldam, within a couple of weeks after the book was published, and immediately saw that we saw eye to eye on a lot of things in as far as the movie went. And so that process started very early.
When I read the book first, I thought the Kite Runner it's just going to be such a tricky adaptation. It's so visual and it's such a great story, but I just thought, how are you going to really adapt it? How are you going to be able to structurally work it out? And there were so many things I loved about the book, and I knew immediately you can't include all these things into the movie. So what are you going to leave out? And that's would be really painful.
Well, I never actually thought about adapting the novel myself. I had, lived in that world for a year and a half by then, and I was actually kind of a relief to let somebody else have a crack at it.
David Benioff is, of course, a novelist himself and a proper, literary writer who's also had a lot of success in Hollywood and written some fantastic screenplays. He and Mark knew each other from a previous collaboration. He knew Rebecca and I. And when we sat down to meet with him and talk about it, we identified some of the challenges and seemed to agree about the things that were essential and that had to be kept, and the things that were, going to have to find a way to reinvent themselves in this new form.
There's something really noble about Khaled, and when you're adapting someone else's book, it's a kind of a tricky process because it's very hard to make the original writer happy. And I'm a novelist as well, so I understand that it's the novelist, the writer's baby, and you're basically taking that baby away from them and giving it plastic surgery. And Khaled was the opposite of that. I mean, he was always incredibly cooperative. He was always really enthusiastic, and he knew that certain changes would have to be made. He was very aware of that from the beginning, and he was a great resource for me. I mean, aside from the fact that he gave me his blessing, he also. I'm from New York City. I didn't grow up in Kabul. I don't have that background. I'm far from an expert, and any questions I had, I'd send Khaled emails at 3 in the morning and I'd get a response in a couple hours saying, whatever the question was, whether it was related to some type of Muslim ritual or growing up in Kabul at the time, anything, he was there for me. So it was a huge asset.
The screenplay David worked on was in pretty good shape. And when I was reading, I said, this is really good, and I loved the book, but I thought the screenplay really captures a lot of it. And there were certain things I wanted David to include in the screenplay, like the pomegranate scene, which wasn't in there.
Pass mara bazan. Darso.
David managed to take all the things that resonated, I think, with readers in that novel, the things that people loved about that novel, and managed to capture it in his script. And I feel like there's a good kinship between the film and the book.
There are two of my favorite lines. There's a way to be good again, and for you 1,000 times over. Both lines I love. There's a way to be good again because we all have that chance to, redeem ourselves. And for you 1,000 times over has this emotional beat that you would do anything for someone else and someone who you truly love. And what I love about it, there's an unconditional love about it. And I think unconditional love is something we all strive for, in a sense, that we all have that goal, that we ultimately can unconditionally love someone. And for you 1,000 times over has that weight. It just has that weight to carry that unconditional love up the hill and up into the sky. And it's almost like a sort of like this kite motion at the end. You want to fly, you want to be up there with a kite, and you want to be free and forgiven, and it's all about that.
میخوایی گوده پرانه برای تازوتی بگیرم؟
بر 2000 دفعه